The UFC will sometimes match up legends of the sport praying that they'll lose.
They wanted him to lose, and they wanted him to lose badly on the way out.
The aim? Generate tomorrow's next star, knowing that the older fighter doesn't have a lot left to offer the company. And we sometimes get horrible matchups because of it.
It feels like we're getting to the point where someone should start thinking about pressing charges. It doesn't feel like a fair fight.
Sometimes it goes in the UFC's favor, but not always. And sometimes the old vet stops the hype train right in its tracks. So let's look at the time the UFC abandoned their longtime stars, hoping to build a name off their back. We've all seen it. Dana White announces a fight and the entire MMA fanbase looks at it a little confused. It's usually a former champion, someone with a decade worth of sacrifice to the UFC who's clearly on the decline. And against them, a young, hungry prospect in their absolute prime.
Dude, when he was standing next to Johnny Hendricks at the weigh-ins, I was like, no, Johnny, you are not a middleweight. This is a middleweight. This is a big middleweight. He's so, look how much bigger he is than Johnny. I mean,
and shredded.
And the fight was basically an assault. It was an assault. You would never believe that Johnny Hendricks was a former world champion if you saw the way the Eraser beat the shit out of him.
It's very obvious what the UFC's hoping for. They may say it's to test the up-and-comer against a chiseled veteran, and while there might be a little bit of truth to that, the real reason is that they could make a star overnight if the prospect delivers. It's very much a pro wrestling model, and almost always at the end of their career, they'll give a shock victory to a lesser-known name. It's their way of passing on the torch, essentially, and the UFC has absolutely taken a page out of the WWE's book. After all, the older fighter isn't going to get more popular, can't headline pay-per-views like perhaps they used to. From a business point of view, the biggest thing they have left to offer is to sacrifice them for the long-term health of the UFC. It's purely a financial decision. They need stars.
Like, who are your guys? Now, I was on a radio show earlier today with my friend JD Bunkus, Roger Sportsnet, and he has been banging this drum for a long time. There are no stars. They have a big star problem. And I would always say, nah. But for the first time, I was like, no, you are right.
So when push comes to shove, the UFC will try and set up the very fighter that they once paraded as one of their most cherished assets. One of the most blatant and recent cases of this has been with Paddy Pimblett. With the funky hair, mic skills, and hype behind him, it's in the UFC's best interest for him to do well. So during his rise, the UFC handpicked favorable fights to increase his stock.
Let this slow roll build for as long as possible. Give him a guy who's not ranked. I don't care. The guys I was talking to New York Rick and GC on the show, they were saying, maybe a Dan Hooker or a Jalen Turner. I say give him a guy, and I'm not trying to knock a Jamie Malarkey, but I don't think you need to test him just yet because the star is shining, he's exploding, no one's asking for this.
But when that time did come to bump up the competition, the UFC did it very tactically. Firstly, against Tony Ferguson, an absolute legend of the sport, but a fighter who had lost 6 in a row, looked a shadow of his former self, but still carried a lot of name value.
So Paddy the Baddy versus Tony Ferguson has been announced. The biggest question for me is the UFC trying to get rid of Tony Ferguson, or they're trying to feed Tony Ferguson to Paddy the Baddy?
Then it was a near 40-year-old King Green. Not quite the same kind of star as Ferguson, but still an established veteran who hopefully shouldn't pose too many problems to Paddy. But at a certain point, the UFC has no real choice but to put their up-and-comer against the very best. Even so, in Paddy's case, they didn't go for Poirier, they didn't go for Oliveira. Instead, a 38-year-old Michael Chandler with just 1 win in his last 5 UFC fights. And sure, eventually you have to throw him in there with Justin Gaethje. But had they first made Paddy versus someone more dangerous like Benoit Saint-Denis, Mauricio Rufy, or Rafael Fiziev instead of Tony Ferguson, who knows? The hype train may have been derailed a long time ago. And in fact, all of those 3 guys have been in positions to build their name off the old legend. BSD had the chance against an aging Dustin Poirier when most thought the Frenchman was going on to big things. Fiziev had his chances against Gaethje, and now Mauricio Rufy, someone the UFC would love to become a star with his flashy style, is getting an even older Michael Chandler. But this has been an issue for a long time in the UFC, and they even did the same thing with Brock Lesnar all the way back in 2008. After Lesnar lost his UFC debut to Frank Mir, the world realized they rushed their new star a little too quickly.
It was very humbling, my first fight in the UFC against Frank, because I had prepared for the knee bar so many times, and I actually probably a million times that had prepared to how to get out and counter what he got me in. And it was like I was in practice drilling and how to get out of it. And so I was like, oh shit, this is happening. Yeah, that's good. I'm done.
So as a result, they looked down the roster for a favorable matchup and ended up with Heath Herring. If you don't know that name, it doesn't matter. This was a guy with over 40 MMA fights. He'd competed for Pride heavyweight title and fought some of the best guys in the world. But importantly, he lost pretty much all of them. And even more importantly, he very much struggled with powerful wrestlers. It was the perfect way for him to get back in the win column and then go on to win the title. And while that was more of a tune-up fight, sometimes the UFC essentially gives up on a fighter and they just become a pawn to create stars. And sadly, that was definitely the case for BJ Penn. Newer fans might not remember, but Penn was one of the biggest stars in the entire sport at one point.
Well, BJ, when you were on top, you were one of the baddest motherfuckers on earth. You really were. You were a guy who went all the way up to heavyweight to fight Lyoto Machida. I mean, I remember that fight.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you did some wild shit, dude, and you were strangling a lot of people, man. And for jiu-jitsu guys, like for all my jiu-jitsu guys, you were the man, because you were a smaller guy who choked out Matt Hughes, you know, who was so good at the time, man. And Matt Hughes was a tank. When you got his back and choked him, everybody's like, oh shit,
Jiu-Jitsu's back.
He was a 2-division champ, technically one of the best ever, and had serious name value. But sadly, he just became food for rising stars. First against Rory McDonald, who was 13-1, a natural welterweight, and was the new generation of MMA fighters. And then undoubtedly the worst time the UFC used BJ Penn, though, was against a young Yair Rodriguez. Yair was 14-1, unbeaten in the UFC, and had wins over really solid competition like Dan Hooker already. So to give him someone that quick, that flashy to a near 40-year-old Penn who was on a 2.5-year layoff was borderline criminal. The beatdown Yair gave was one of those rare fights that fans felt uncomfortable watching. It looked like they dragged someone's dad out of the crowd and made him go toe-to-toe with one of the scariest kickers the sport has ever seen.
Oh! 360 round kick! He's hitting him with some jumping front kick to the face.
I don't want to see
right
this.
hand.
I don't like this.
Oh man, the high kick is there, man. He's got to be careful because BJ with the right hand. He's got to be careful because he's backing up and he's dropping that right hand. Oh my God, he's getting lit up.
This is what I didn't want to see.
And he's got his back to the cage and he catches the kick again. Oh, again to the arm. And again. Yeah, but he's taking on the
doing it with
forearm,
one
dude.
arm.
And and then he goes under to the body.
He's going to
twice.
switch kick to the head. He's going to switch kick to the head.
Jesus Christ.
Get ready.
It felt like they tried the same with Yair, offering him Frankie Edgar in the next fight. But the veteran exposed Rodriguez's lack of wrestling and stopped the prospect in his tracks. And that's the thing, it normally goes the way the UFC intended. But this is MMA, and weird things happen. Just like the time the UFC tried to pull off perhaps the biggest mismatch they could to build a star, and thankfully, the fight never ended up happening.
We're getting to the point where someone should start thinking about pressing charges. It doesn't feel like a fair fight. It feels like a very, very cruel thing to do to someone that is a legitimate legend. Because they've spoken out against the organization, they're going to get executed live on TV. That's kind of how it feels.
Obviously, Nate Diaz was one of the biggest names in the entire sport, and for the very final fight on his contract, the UFC decided to give him Khamzat Chimaev of all people on the roster. This was as clear a setup as you get.
Were you disappointed that you didn't get the chance to beat Nate up, given how you feel toward him?
Yeah, but if I fight him, I would kill him, I would be in the jail, so maybe I have to be happy.
Given what Chimaev had already done in his career and where Nate Diaz was in his, this was as one-sided a matchup as any. Khamzat ended up missing weight by a ton, forcing the card to reshuffle and him to fight Kevin Holland, a much more appropriate contest. It couldn't be more obvious that the UFC wanted Diaz to get utterly destroyed and continue building the next star.
What was supposed to happen this weekend was not right, was not fair, was not done in good faith, was not done the right way, was not how a legend, a guy who has done things the right way, represented the sport in a unique, honest, authentic way, was not how his chapter, his journey, his career potentially in the UFC was supposed to end.
Thankfully for Diaz, he fought Tony Ferguson instead. Again, a fight that made a lot more sense and was able to end his UFC career with a victory. It just goes to show that in Diaz's case, you can be in the UFC for 15 years, win the Ultimate Fighter, be a part of the sport's biggest events. But when your time is up, they'll happily try and lock you in the octagon with a size disadvantage against one of MMA's scariest prospects of all time.
They wanted him to lose, and they wanted him to lose badly on the way out. They wanted to hurt his stock on the way out. They wanted him to get mauled on the way out. They found the worst possible opponent for him on the way out. And what happened? The MMA gods said no. Not this weekend.
They'll prioritize the business over any kind of courtesy to the fighter. So let's rapid fire many more times this happened. You had the returning Uriah Faber after a 3-year mini-retirement, a pioneer of the lighter weight classes, a UFC Hall of Famer. At 40 years old and the UFC says, hey, we got this Russian guy called Petr Yan, wanna fight him? For those in the know, it was cruel matchmaking. Even Dana questioned it after the fight.
Uriah doesn't want to hear that he's old, but unfortunately, Uriah, you're old, okay? And he looked amazing in his last fight, right? Comes out and beats a guy that most people probably didn't think he was gonna beat. And he looked damn good tonight until Jan started catching him and lighting him up. And Faber's tough, he's durable, he's well-rounded, he's a good fighter. But the question becomes why?
Jan battered Faber in one of those rare fights where you feel sorry for the losing side. And then he went on to win the title just half a year later. It was a very similar story for Michael Bisping, another icon of the sport. Yet just 3 weeks after getting dropped and choked unconscious by Georges St-Pierre, the UFC found him another fight.
They match up very well. The style makes sense. There's a lot of that. What I don't like about it is it's 21 days after Michael Bisping just got, choked out, KO'd. Let's be honest. What put him on the ground was a left hook by Georges St-Pierre. And so that's a little scary, the travel.
Kelvin Gastelum was a pretty terrifying striker at the time, and on a Legends beating tour. He finished Tim Kennedy, then Vitor Belfort, and now it was Bisping's turn. Gastelum got a brutal knockout in just a couple of minutes in, what was sadly the Brits' final fight in MMA.
I mean, you wouldn't even ask a guy who went through what he went through 3 weeks later to fly to a different country. By the way, that fight was in a different country. I want to say Japan, that's off the top of my head. Definitely in a different country. I remember that much. And then go take on a hammer, a younger, up-and-coming, Ultimate Fighter winning Kelvin Gastelum. You just want to do that.
Some fighters just seem to get rough treatment, and Cowboy Cerrone is one of those. He just got fed to a young and flying Darren Till in Poland, of all places, off the back of 2 losses already.
But also with the UFC, whoever made this fight, what are you doing? You need stars. Cowboy's one of your biggest stars. You have him fighting Darren Till in Poland on a fight pass.
Yeah.
It's just, it's mismanagement all the way around. I don't get it.
Just 6 months later, the UFC matched him up with Alexander Hernandez, who was generating a lot of hype at the time. But that was one of those rare cases where the vet proves he's far from done in the sport yet. And even his fight against Conor McGregor was the same. Sure, Conor obviously wasn't a rising prospect, but the UFC wanted him to get a win and get the star power going again before giving him the bigger fights. And an older Donald Cerrone was a perfect matchup. Someone who doesn't wrestle much, has a tendency to start slow, and admits he has troubles with the pressure.
And the first time since he fought Diego Brandao that he's fighting a fighter coming off a loss as well. That's a key thing that no one's talking about, right? The mental part of coming off a loss and then fighting on a stage like Conor McGregor. And let's be honest, a lot of you say that about Cerrone, and he has said that about himself. Mentally, sometimes he falters in those situations. He crumbles in those situations.
And this list could quite genuinely go on all day. They gave one of the GOATs in Anderson Silva to a younger, newer version of himself in Israel Adesanya. Let Corey Sandhagen make a name for himself off the former champ Frankie Edgar. And the UFC recently did the same, matching up an old star in Henry Cejudo to the rising prospect Peyton Talbot. Speaking of Israel Adesanya, lately he's been on the receiving end of this cruel policy. After his loss to Sean Strickland at UFC 293, his career took a turn for the worse, and he's now on a 4-fight losing streak. 2 of those losses came from the UFC, using his name to propel new prospects in the division. First, the rising Dagestani Nasruddin Imavov, followed by America's new blood Joe Pyfer.
This is a classic case that eventually happens to everybody. Everybody in the division has to kind of go through this test. You've got the guy who's famous for coming in and saying he's the new dog in the yard, but now he's the old dog in the yard. And now you've got Joe Pfeiffer, who's the new dog in the yard, essentially trying to do what Izzy did many years ago and kind of take his place in the yard. So it's just a kind of a natural thing that happens in the UFC.
And although Izzy looked good early in both fights, each one ended in a finish.
I just don't know how you can watch this fight and think that Izzy looks not diminished. He looks diminished to me. Yeah. And how could he not? The guy's had, nearly what? How many fights has the guy ever had in his life?
I think over 100 all told. I was trying, like you can see a certain amount of them, but I think there are a bunch of others that aren't even listed. So over
to say nothing of the gym wars, to say nothing of,
right.
You know what I mean? Like the guy, the fact that he's even as fresh as he is frankly something of a minor miracle.
But what's really interesting is the fact that the UFC don't always go this route. Sometimes fighters are given the respect of a very winnable and fair final fight. Even recently, Michael Chiesa fought Nico Price and was sent into retirement as perfectly as anyone could ask for.
After how the whole fight week went, having my friends, my family, getting to retire at Climate Pledge Arena, Jackson Smith and Jigba coming in the octagon after the fight. I mean, come on, it's like... There's no reason to come back to fighting. This was for me, it was perfect to get the win. I'm at a loss for words.
They could have given him a scary contender on the rise, but opted not to, presumably because of his relationship as an occasional member of the UFC media team. But even Robbie Lawler, a huge fan favorite, got the same treatment. Coincidentally, a final fight against Nico Price again. So it's definitely not a hard rule the UFC follows. But the brutal truth is that this model will never change. There's way too much upside and demand for the UFC to build new stars for them to not try and do so at the expense of the old legends. And despite some of the backlash they receive, they can hide behind the fact that in MMA, the best fight the best. No one should get preferential treatment, and every fight is winnable. That is all true, and all reasons why we love the UFC. But at the end of the day, fans can definitely spot when the UFC is offering up their old superstar as a sort of sacrifice for the future of the sport. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you'll be sure to enjoy this similar deep dive into how the UFC keeps its fighters broke. You can watch that here.